The alarm is a scream you feel in your teeth. Smoke, thick and acrid, claws at your throat. The deck beneath your feet lurches, a groan of tortured steel echoing from deep within the ship's soul. Somewhere men are shouting, but their voices are swallowed by the hiss of ruptured steam lines and the concussive roar of another explosion. You're not a pilot. You're not a gunner. You're a member of the damage control team, and your war is fought with wrenches and timbers in the burning heart of a wounded giant that refuses to die. In the vast, brutal theater of the Pacific War, one ship would become more than a weapon. She would become a legend, a symbol of a nation's will to endure. This is the story of that ship, the USS Enterprise, the most dangerous American warship of World War II. Her story begins not with a bang, but with a near miss, an accident of fate that would place her at the epicenter of America's fight for survival. On the morning of December the 7th, 1941, while the Imperial Japanese Navy unleashed its fury upon Pearl Harbor, the Enterprise was at sea, battling a storm just 200 miles west of Oahu. She had been delivering aircraft to Wake Island, a routine mission that saved her from the fiery graveyard her sister ships were becoming. As she steamed towards port, her own scout planes were the first to radio back the unbelievable truth. An attack was underway. The returning crew didn't see a harbor. They saw an inferno. The sky was black with oily smoke, the waters littered with the burning hulks of a fleet that had been, just hours before, the embodiment of American power in the Pacific. In that moment of national shock and despair, with the heart of the fleet torn out, the USS Enterprise became something new. She was no longer just one of 3 carriers in the Pacific. She was the tip of a broken spear, the principal instrument of a vengeance that would take years to achieve. In the dark months that followed, as Japanese forces stormed across the Pacific, the Enterprise and her task force were a lone beacon of defiance. They became hunters, prowling the vast ocean, executing hit-and-run raids on Japanese-held islands. These were not decisive blows, not yet. They were pinpricks, designed to disrupt the enemy's timetable, and more importantly, to send a message back home. America was still in the fight. The sailors aboard learned the hard rhythm of war, the tension of the long patrol, the adrenaline of launching aircraft into the unknown, and the gnawing anxiety of waiting for them to return. Then, in April of 1942, the Enterprise was tasked with her most audacious mission to date. She was to carry 16 Army B-25 Mitchell bombers, aircraft never meant to see the deck of a carrier, deep into enemy waters. Their target was the heart of the Japanese Empire itself, Tokyo. The Doolittle raid was a mission born of desperation, a psychological blow aimed at shaking the enemy's sense of invincibility. For the crew of the Enterprise, it was a profound risk. Their flight deck was crowded with bombers, too large to be stored below, leaving them vulnerable, unable to launch their own fighters for defense. They were a shield for a dagger aimed at the enemy's capital, sailing further into hostile territory than any American surface fleet had dared. The mission was a testament to the ship's versatility and the crew's resolve, a silent promise of the greater battles that lay ahead, where the Enterprise would not just be a participant, but the decisive factor. The legend was beginning to form, forged in the crucible of defeat and defiance. The Doolittle raid, while a stunning propaganda victory, served another more dangerous purpose. It poked the hornet's nest. Humiliated and enraged, the Japanese High Command accelerated a plan to eliminate the American carrier threat once and for all. Their target was a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific, a strategic outpost named Midway. The plan was a masterpiece of naval strategy. involving the largest fleet the world had ever seen, designed to lure the remnants of the U.S. Navy into a decisive, final battle. What they didn't know was that American codebreakers had peeled back the layers of their encrypted messages, revealing the time, place, and objective of the attack. For the United States, it was a chance to turn the tables, to set a trap for the hunters. At the heart of this desperate counter-gambit was the USS Enterprise. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, the tension on her flight deck was a physical thing. The sea was calm, the sky clear. It was a perfect day for a battle. One by one, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers, their engines roaring to life, were catapulted into the dawn. Leading them was the Enterprise's Air Group Commander, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey. His orders were precise: fly to the predicted location of the Japanese fleet, strike, and return. But war is a chaotic enterprise, a collision of perfect plans and imperfect realities. When McCluskey and his 32 dive bombers arrived at the designated coordinates, they found nothing but an empty expanse of ocean. The Japanese fleet was not there. Below him, the Pacific was a serene, indifferent blue. His fuel gauges were already ticking down, a merciless clock counting away the precious minutes needed for the return flight. Every instinct, every line in the manual screamed for him to turn back. His mission was to find the enemy, but his primary duty was to his men and his machines. To press on was to risk everything: his squadron, his own life, and the irreplaceable aircraft, on nothing more than a hunch. In this single moment, the entire weight of the Pacific War rested on the shoulders of one man, thousands of feet above an empty sea. The fate of the battle, and perhaps the world, would be decided not by a grand strategy session in a war room, but by a pilot's intuition. McCluskey made his choice. Instead of turning south, back towards the Enterprise, he wheeled his formation to the northwest, extending his search pattern. It was a flagrant disobedience of the operational doctrine, a gamble of monumental proportions. He was betting that the Japanese fleet, having been delayed, was now somewhere along this new vector. With every passing minute, the fuel needles dipped lower, and the chances of his squadron ever seeing the deck of the Enterprise again grew slimmer. He was flying on borrowed time, guided only by a deep-seated conviction that he was heading towards history. His men followed, their trust in their leader absolute, as they flew deeper into the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the Pacific. Then a glint of white on the blue canvas below. A single Japanese destroyer, slicing through the water, leaving a crisp white wake. It was steaming hard to the northeast, presumably to rejoin its fleet after a futile hunt for an American submarine. For Wade McCluskey, it was a breadcrumb trail in the wilderness. He banked his squadron, aligning them with the destroyer's course. It was another gamble, piled upon the first, but it was the only lead he had. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The fuel needles continued their relentless downward march. And then, on the horizon, he saw them. Not one ship, but an entire armada. The legendary Kido Butai, the first carrier striking force, was laid out below. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sailing in perfect formation, surrounded by a screen of battleships and cruisers. It was the very heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the force that had laid waste to Pearl Harbor, and it was utterly unaware of the 32 angels of death circling high above. What followed was one of history's most perfect collisions of chance and preparation. The Japanese carriers were caught at their most vulnerable moment. Their combat air patrols, their fighter screen, had been drawn down to sea level, distracted by the heroic but ultimately doomed American torpedo bomber squadrons that had attacked just moments before. On their flight decks, a controlled chaos reigned. Planes were being frantically rearmed and refueled for a second strike against the American fleet. The decks were littered with live torpedoes, high-explosive bombs, and snaking fuel lines. They were, in effect, floating powder kegs, and McCluskey's dive bombers had just arrived with the match. He gave the signal. The SBD Dauntless bombers peeled off, one by one, tipping over into a near-vertical dive, the wind screaming past their canopies. For the pilots, the world narrowed to a single, terrifying point of focus, the bright red circle of the rising sun painted on the wooden flight deck of an enemy carrier. Anti-aircraft fire erupted around them, black puffs of smoke clawing at their wings, but their concentration was absolute. They were instruments of a terrible, swift justice. McCluskey himself led the charge against the carrier Kaga. His bomb, and those of his wingmen, struck home with devastating precision. The carrier's deck, packed with volatile material, erupted in a chain reaction of catastrophic explosions. Within seconds, a pillar of fire and smoke billowed thousands of feet into the air. Simultaneously, another section of his squadron descended upon the flagship Akagi. Bombs tore through its flight deck, detonating among the armed and waiting aircraft in the hangar bay below. The pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed into a raging, uncontrollable inferno. In less than 5 minutes of terrifying, concentrated violence, the Enterprise's air group had mortally wounded 2 of the 4 Japanese carriers. With assistance from the Yorktown's bombers, which crippled a 3rd, the Soryu, the course of the war was rewritten. In the span of a single coffee break, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had been fundamentally, irrevocably altered. The pilots from the Enterprise, their fuel tanks now dangerously low, pulled away from the apocalypse they had unleashed, witnessing a victory so swift and complete, it bordered on the unbelievable. Midway was the turning point, the high water mark of Japanese aggression from which they would never recover. But for the USS Enterprise, it was only the beginning of a long and brutal slog. The next chapter of her war would unfold in the disease-ridden jungles and shark-infested waters of the Solomon Islands. The strategic focus of the Pacific War now shifted to a malaria-plagued island barely known to the outside world, Guadalcanal. Here, American Marines had seized a vital, half-finished airfield, and the Japanese were determined to take it back at any cost. The ensuing campaign was a grueling 6-month war of attrition, fought on land, at sea, and in the air. For the Enterprise, this meant a constant, nerve-wracking cycle of patrols in the dangerous waters north of the island, known as Torpedo Junction. Her pilots flew daily missions, battling Japanese bombers and the legendary Zero fighters in the skies over Guadalcanal, providing a fragile umbrella of air cover for the beleaguered Marines on the ground. The price of this protection was steep. On October 26, 1942, during the fierce Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the Enterprise found herself in the crosshairs. Japanese dive bombers, flying with a suicidal fanaticism, swarmed the American task force. The carrier Hornet was hit repeatedly and fatally wounded, destined to sink beneath the waves. The Enterprise fought for her life. 3 separate bomb hits tore through her steel skin. One 550-pound bomb smashed into the forward flight deck, plunging deep into the ship's guts before exploding. Another ripped a 10-foot gash in the deck, and a third, a near miss, sent a geyser of shrapnel-laced water across the ship, shredding men and equipment. The ship was a scene from Dante's Inferno. Fires raged, compartments flooded, and the air was thick with the stench of burning fuel and cordite. The flight deck was a twisted landscape of buckled steel and gaping holes. Critically, her forward aircraft elevator was jammed in the up position, a crippling blow for a ship whose entire purpose was to launch and recover aircraft. More than 40 of her crew were dead, nearly 80 wounded. To any outside observer, the Enterprise was finished, a mortally wounded beast that should have been limping home for extensive, months-long repairs. But in the desperate calculus of the Guadalcanal campaign, time was a luxury the Americans did not have. With the Hornet gone, the Enterprise was now the only operational American carrier in the entire Pacific Ocean. The fate of the Marines on Guadalcanal and the entire Solomon Islands campaign rested squarely on her damaged decks. There was no one else. The call went out to Admiral William Bull Halsey, the pugnacious commander of the South Pacific area. The message from the Enterprise's captain, Osborne Bennett Hardison, was grim but resolute. They were hurt, but they were still in the fight. Halsey's reply was legendary in its simplicity and its sheer audacity. "Patch her up and get her back in there." The wounded giant would not be sent home. Her trial by fire was about to enter its most critical phase. The Enterprise limped into the naval base at Noumea, New Caledonia, a floating casualty of war. The damage was far more extensive than initial reports suggested. The ship's frame was twisted, her electrical systems a chaotic mess of severed wires, and her forward elevator remained a monument of frozen steel. Under normal circumstances, she would have been sent back to Pearl Harbor or even the West Coast for a complete overhaul, a process that would take months. But these were not normal circumstances. Intelligence reports screamed that the Japanese were mounting a massive naval offensive, the Tokyo Express on a grand scale, aimed at wiping out the American forces on Guadalcanal once and for all. 2 Japanese battleships, the Hiei and the Kirishima, were steaming south, their mission to obliterate the precious Henderson Field with their 14-inch guns. If they succeeded, the Marines would be left without air cover, ripe for annihilation. The Enterprise had to be ready. There was no alternative. Into this desperate race against time stepped a unit that embodied American ingenuity and sheer grit, the Seabees. These were the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, men who were trained to build and to fight. Working alongside the ship's own exhausted crew, they descended into the mangled guts of the Enterprise with a relentless energy. They were not shipwrights in the traditional sense. They were carpenters, electricians, and steelworkers, applying their terrestrial skills to the alien anatomy of a warship. For 11 days, the sounds of hammers, cutting torches, and shouted commands echoed through the ship 24 hours a day. They didn't have the proper parts, so they improvised, cannibalizing what they could and fabricating the rest from raw steel. The most daunting task was the forward elevator. The complex machinery was beyond their ability to fully repair in the time allotted. Their solution was brutally pragmatic. They encased the entire mechanism in a massive block of concrete and steel, sealing it permanently in the up position. It was an ugly, unorthodox fix, but it made the flight deck whole again. They worked while the ship was being refueled and rearmed, a hive of frantic, purposeful activity. Men worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, catching a few hours of sleep on the hard deck before rising to work again. Presiding over this organized chaos was the ship's damage control officer, Lieutenant Commander Herschel Albert Smith. He was a quiet, methodical genius, a man who understood the ship not as a machine, but as a living organism. He and his teams had kept the Enterprise alive at Santa Cruz, and now they were overseeing her miraculous resurrection. On November 11th, with repair crews still on board, The USS Enterprise weighed anchor and steamed north, back towards the fight. She was not fully healed. She was, in fact, still a patient undergoing surgery, with the Seabees working feverishly as she sailed into combat. She was a patched-up, wounded warrior, but she was operational. She was the only shield the Marines on Guadalcanal had, a lone carrier against an approaching armada, a symbol of a navy that refused to be broken. As the Enterprise steamed north, the naval battle of Guadalcanal erupted in a series of savage, point-blank engagements. American cruisers and destroyers, heavily outgunned, threw themselves at the Japanese battleships in a desperate night action, a brawl in the dark that bought precious time. In the brutal calculus of naval warfare, they were a sacrifice, trading their own hulls for another day of survival for Henderson Field. Now it was the Enterprise's turn. On the morning of November 13th, her air group, a mix of SBD Dauntless dive bombers and TBF Avenger torpedo planes, took to the skies. Their target was the battleship Hii, already damaged from the previous night's chaotic fight. The Japanese behemoth, its steering crippled, was circling helplessly in the waters north of Savo Island. The pilots of the Enterprise descended upon it like wolves on a wounded stag. Wave after wave of bombers and torpedo planes hammered the vessel. The Avengers, flying low and steady into a wall of anti-aircraft fire, dropped their tin fish, scoring multiple hits below the waterline. The Dauntlesses plunged from the heavens, planting bombs on its pagoda-like superstructure. For hours, the assault continued, a relentless demonstration of the carrier's power to project force. By nightfall, the Hai, one of the ships that had shelled Pearl Harbor, was a burning wreck, finally sent to the bottom by its own crew to prevent capture. One battleship was down, but another, the Kirishima, was still coming, part of a larger Japanese bombardment force. The next day, the Enterprise's planes were up again, this time striking the Japanese cruiser screen and transport ships, inflicting heavy losses and disrupting the enemy's landing plans. That night, under the command of Admiral Willis Lee, the American battleships Washington and South Dakota engaged the Kirishima in a climactic gun duel. Radar, the new eyes of the fleet, allowed the Washington to pinpoint the Japanese battleship in the pitch-black darkness. Her 16-inch guns spoke with devastating effect, turning the Kirishima into a blazing ruin in a matter of minutes. While this final surface engagement sealed the Japanese defeat, the victory would have been impossible without the crucial role played by the Enterprise. Her aircraft had not only sunk the Hiei, but had also attrited the Japanese surface forces and, most critically, provided the air cover that allowed the American ships to operate. She was the linchpin of the entire operation. While her pilots fought in the skies, down below on her decks and in her engineering spaces, the repair work continued. The Seabees and the ship's crew, sailing through a combat zone, were still patching, welding, and rewiring their wounded ship. The Enterprise was simultaneously a weapon, a hospital, and a construction site. This extraordinary feat of resilience, fighting and healing at the same time, cemented her growing reputation. To the Japanese, she was becoming more than just a ship. She was an enigma. They had hit her hard at Santa Cruz. Their propaganda had confidently and repeatedly declared her sunk. Yet here she was again, her planes ruling the skies over Guadalcanal, turning the tide of a pivotal battle. This was the birth of her legend, the moment she transcended her hull number and became something mythical to her enemies. They began to call her the Gray Ghost, a phantom warship that could not be killed, a specter of American resolve that haunted the waters of the South Pacific. The victory at Guadalcanal marked a seismic shift in the Pacific War. The desperate defensive scrambling of 1942 gave way to the methodical, grinding offensive of the years that followed. American shipyards, humming with wartime production, began to unleash a torrent of new warships. The sleek, powerful Essex-class carriers, larger and more advanced, started to arrive in the Pacific, forming the core of what would become the legendary Fast Carrier Task Force. For the USS Enterprise, this meant she was no longer the lone wolf, the solitary shield against the storm. She was now the veteran, the grizzled elder stateswoman of a growing family of giants. Nicknamed the Big E by her own crew, she became a floating university of naval aviation, her battle-hardened pilots and deck crews passing on their hard-won knowledge to the green crews of the new carriers. But the Enterprise was far from ready to be a mere training vessel. She was a leader, and she would lead from the front, taking the fight ever closer to Japan. As the island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific began, the Enterprise was instrumental in developing a revolutionary and terrifying new doctrine: night carrier operations. Launching and recovering aircraft from a pitching, moving runway is one of the most dangerous feats in military aviation. To do it in complete, disorienting darkness was considered suicidal. The risk of a pilot becoming spatially disoriented, of missing the deck by mere feet and plunging into the black ocean, was immense. Yet the tactical advantage was undeniable. It would allow the American fleet to strike the enemy around the clock, denying them the cover of darkness to regroup, repair, and rearm. The Enterprise became the pioneer. Her flight deck became a laboratory for this new kind of warfare. The process was a masterpiece of controlled chaos and human trust. Pilots would launch into a black void, their world shrinking to the faint glow of their cockpit instruments. Upon return, they would see only a handful of dimly lit guide lights and the ghostly fluorescent wands of the landing signal officer. This single man, standing on a small platform at the edge of the deck, was their lifeline, guiding them down with precise hand signals, a silent language of survival exchanged between ship and pilot. The mental and physical strain was incredible, but the crews of the Enterprise mastered it. She became the first carrier to be officially designated as night-capable, and her air groups executed devastating night raids on key Japanese strongholds like the fortress of Truk Lagoon. This innovation doubled the combat effectiveness of the American carrier fleet, a tactical revolution that left the Japanese Navy reeling. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the Enterprise seemed to be everywhere at once, her name a constant feature in the operational logs of the Pacific Campaign. From the Gilbert and Marshall Islands to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the infamous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, she was there, her planes clearing the skies, her guns protecting the fleet. Her reputation for indestructibility grew with each battle. While newer ships took damage, the Big E, guided by the almost supernatural skill of her damage control teams, seemed to shake off every blow, a testament to the legacy of men like Herschel Smith. For her enemies, the Gray Ghost was no longer just a rumor. She was a terrifying certainty, a ship that simply would not die. By 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached its brutal endgame. The American war machine was now at the very doorstep of the Japanese home islands. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa were desperate, bloody affairs characterized by a fanatical, last-ditch defense. For the Enterprise and the rest of the fleet, This meant facing a terrifying new weapon, one born of sheer desperation, the Kamikaze. These divine wind attacks were more than just suicide missions. They were a form of psychological warfare, turning human beings into guided missiles. For the sailors on the ships below, it was a unique kind of horror. There was no hiding, no trench to cower in. They could only watch as a plane, piloted by a man determined to die, screamed down from the sky, aiming not for a near miss, but for a direct, annihilating impact. The Enterprise, with her legendary luck and peerless anti-aircraft gunnery, had weathered the storm for months, her gun crews creating a curtain of steel that swatted pilots from the sky. But in war, luck is a finite resource. On May 14, 1945, while operating off Okinawa, her luck finally ran out. A Japanese Zero, skillfully evading the storm of flak, plunged toward the carrier. In the final seconds of its dive, it rolled, aiming its belly and its 500-pound bomb directly for the forward flight deck. The impact was catastrophic. The Kamikaze struck near the number 1 aircraft elevator, the very one that had been so pragmatically concreted in place back at Noumea. The resulting explosion was immense, a volcanic eruption of fire, steel, and human bodies. The blast tore a 45 by 36-foot hole in the flight deck, a gaping, fiery maw. More devastatingly, it blew the entire 30,000-pound elevator mechanism a staggering 400 feet into the air before it crashed back down into the sea. The ship was once again a scene of controlled chaos and unimaginable bravery. 14 men were killed instantly, and dozens more were wounded. Fires raged below decks, threatening to reach aviation fuel and ordnance. But the ingrained discipline, the muscle memory of survival honed over 3 years of constant combat, took over. The damage control parties, the spiritual descendants of Herschel Smith's original teams, sprang into action. Without hesitation, they charged into the inferno, their hoses and equipment seeming like toys against the raging fires. They fought with a methodical fury, isolating burning compartments, shoring up weakened bulkheads, and tending to the wounded. Within hours, a feat that seemed impossible, they had the major fires under control. The Big E was grievously wounded, more so than ever before. Her forward elevator was not just damaged, it was gone. Her flight deck was a mangled ruin. This time there would be no quick patch-up job at a forward base. This wound was too deep. Her war was finally over. As she pulled away from the coast of Japan, turning eastward for the long voyage home to Puget Sound for repairs, she left behind a legacy unmatched in the annals of naval warfare. She had been present for nearly every major engagement of the Pacific conflict, from the first dark day at Pearl Harbor to the final, fiery battles off Okinawa. She had earned an incredible 20 battle stars, more than any other American warship in World War II. The Gray Ghost, the ship that refused to sink, was finally going home. The Enterprise was still in the Puget Sound Navy Yard, her wounds being mended, when the world changed forever. The flash of atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought the Second World War to an abrupt and stunning conclusion. For the ship that had been in the fight from the very first day, there was a quiet irony in her absence from the final surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay. While other ships stood in silent witness to the end of the conflict she had done so much to win, the Big E was a patient, resting on the sidelines. Her first post-war mission was one of peace, as part of Operation Magic Carpet. She was refitted to carry thousands of soldiers, sailors, and Marines on their final journey home from the Pacific. The flight deck that had once launched instruments of war was now a crowded space of joyous, weary men, eager to see their homes and families after years of conflict. It was a noble final duty, but for a warrior like the Enterprise, the world had run out of wars to fight. And the post-war era was one of austerity and rapid technological change. The jet age was dawning, and pre-war carriers like the Enterprise were seen as obsolete, relics of a bygone era. Despite her unparalleled combat record, the Navy decommissioned her in 1947. She was laid up, a silent giant moored with the Ghost Fleet, her heroic past gathering dust. A public campaign, led by her former sailors and admirers, was launched to save her. The dream was to preserve the Big E as a national memorial, a floating museum where future generations could walk the decks of the ship that had held the line at Midway and Guadalcanal. Donations poured in from across the country, a testament to the place she held in the nation's heart. But it was not enough. In an age before widespread historical preservation, the government saw only a 90,000-ton liability. The cost of maintaining her was deemed too high. The final, heartbreaking decision was made. In 1958, the USS Enterprise, the most decorated warship in American history, was sold for scrap. Her final voyage was a slow, ignominious tow to the shipbreaking yards of Kearney, New Jersey. There, the cutting torches began their grim work, methodically disassembling the legend, piece by piece. The steel that had withstood Japanese bombs and kamikazes was peeled away. The decks that had launched heroes were cut into sections, and the hull that had carried a nation's hopes was reduced to nothing. The physical vessel was gone. But the tragic loss of the Enterprise served as a powerful, painful catalyst. Her scrapping sparked a national outcry, a collective realization that the nation was allowing its most precious historical artifacts to simply vanish. This outrage fueled the modern movement to preserve historic naval vessels. Because the Enterprise was lost, ships like the Yorktown, the Intrepid, and the Hornet were saved, preserved for posterity, as the floating museums she should have been. In this, the Gray Ghost achieved one final, ironic victory in death. She became a martyr for naval history. Her spirit endures not only in the ships she inspired others to save, but in the annals of history, where her name is synonymous with courage, resilience, and the indomitable will to fight on against impossible odds. The steel is gone, but the legend of the Big E is, and always will be, unsinkable.